Professor Jennifer Locke from The Ohio State University, and I'm here at the TMS Annual Conference on March 1st, 2022. And I am lucky to be here with Professor Carolyn Hansson, who is a Professor Emerita of Materials Engineering at Waterloo University. Carolyn was the first female student in the Royal School of Mines at Imperial College in London, and the first woman graduate with a BSc and PhD in metallurgy in all of the UK. She has worked in the United Kingdom, the United States, Denmark, and Canada in industrial, academic, and not-for-profit sectors. She has focused her research on the influence of the environment on metals such as embrittlement, erosion, corrosion, all on the properties of alloys. So a really long and historied career in a lot of amazing places. And this recording is a part of AIME's Oral History Capture program. So to start, thank you for being here with us, Carolyn. And could you tell us about how you grew up, where you grew up, what your parents did, and kind of about your formative years?
Yes, I was born in England. I'm a war baby, result of a weekend absence without leave that my father took. And I was born in Hazel Grove in Cheshire and grew up mostly in Poynton. Poynton had a population of 6,000 at the time, so it was fairly small. And I had a great upbringing, but it was in the war, so everything was rationed and not easy and so on. Both my parents were forced to leave school at 14, so they didn't have any higher education. My mother was very bright, did get a scholarship to go to high school, because high schools were paying in her day, but her stepfather wouldn't let her and forced her to leave at 14 to earn a living. And my father was a middle manager eventually in a contracting company that produced asphalt, or did asphalt flooring and roads, and was very proud of the red asphalt on the way to Buckingham Palace, red carpet to Buckingham Palace. Neither of them could understand the stuff we were doing because they hadn't had that education. And as far as my father was concerned, the best thing, or the most surprising thing that my sister and I ever did was actually get through high school without being thrown out. He was thrown out of several. Not because he was naughty, not bad, but anyway. The English system was, you took general subjects for a national exam at the age of 16, and then you had the choice of leaving at that point or going on to senior level. And I chose to go on. I wanted to do chemistry, biology, and art at the higher level, but somebody brightly thought that that wouldn't lead to any career and said, oh no, it wouldn't fit in. So I ended up doing chemistry, physics, math, and applied mechanics. Now, I hadn't done physics at the lower level because we didn't have a physics teacher in our all-girls school. I forgot to mention I went to an all-girls school from the age of 4 to the age of 18. So I only did physics for the last 2 years and didn't have the first 3 years. Chemistry, I really enjoyed physical chemistry. I was okay with inorganic, and I hated organic chemistry with a passion. All it seemed to me was learning long words for no reason. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do, and we had a careers convention at school where the school invited people from different professions to come and visit us, and there was a group from the atomic energy, and they said to me, well, how about metallurgy? And so, excuse me, I said, what's metallurgy? Sorry, it was England, metallurgy. And so they sent me some information. I thought that sounds interesting, so I applied to Imperial College, Birmingham and Sheffield, and Imperial was the first to answer. And I went down to Imperial College for an interview, and they told me we don't very often get very many women applying. So in my naivety, I assumed that maybe 10% of the students were women in this area. And it wasn't until I arrived there, literally on the first day, that I discovered I was it at the Royal School of Mines, not just in metallurgy, but in the Royal School of Mines. And people were saying, that's the mines woman, when I walked across the quad and so on. It was terrifying, you know. And it was an interesting time. I had been to an all-girls school, and the boys had been to all boys schools. There was absolutely no meeting of the minds whatsoever. They couldn't figure out why I was there, assumed I wanted to get married, which of course is the last thing on my mind. But the first 6 months were pretty difficult. As an example, the president of the student union of the Royal School of Mines decided it would be appropriate if he took, walked into the union meeting with me to give me some support. Well, at that time, the union had some officers, one of which was an honourable pornographer, whose role it was to entertain the student body during union meetings with rather lewd pictures of women. So when I walked into that meeting with the president, for my benefit, the honourable pornographer put on this huge screen a naked man gently holding his penis for my benefit. So that was the atmosphere that I learnt to live with. So anyway, my classmates had very great difficulty in knowing how to deal with me, didn't want to be a lab partner or anything.
So Carolyn, when you had your event of going to the kind of openings of your university start and the honorable pornographer was there with his showcase of photos, what was the impact on you? Was it embarrassing? Was it scary? Like, how did you feel about that?
All of the above. I was terrified. But the way you have to deal with being terrified is to put on a brave face and go with it.
So you just stayed calm and smiled and...
I can't remember what my face looked like, but I didn't. Anyway, it was terrifying. But you live with it. I mean, this is what the world was like in those days. One of the things that was interesting to me was one of the faculty members, one of the professors in my department once said to me, Miss Russell, because you were never known by your first names. The boys just had their last names. I was Miss Russell, my maiden name. I advise you never to learn to type. So I thought, okay. And so I never did learn to type. I didn't have the opportunity, but I never did. And that proved very useful because when I actually graduated, I received a letter from the president of the equivalent of NIST, the British equivalent of NIST, who happened to be a metallurgist. And he had heard I'd graduated, and he was offering me a job. And I thought, this is very good, very nice, until I got to the bottom and discovered it was a job as his secretary. So I was able to write back and say, I'm terribly sorry, but I don't know how to type. But thank you, I'm honoured to be asked. So that was that one.
Did this person give you the advice of not to type as like a way to help you in the future avoid being a secretary?
He was being very, computers didn't exist in those days, so that was not a problem. He was trying to be helpful. And he was helpful.
Yeah, immensely helpful.
You see now how I still can't type. But anyway, one of the factors that really, 6 months were terrible. And then the boys in my class, and they were boys, not men, accepted me. And I became the designated driver everywhere we went and so on. And in England, everybody played sports. But what do we do with Carolyn? She can't play on a rugby team or whatever. So they made me a scorer of the cricket team. Well, I don't know if you know anything about cricket, but it lasts a long time. The games start at 11, stop for lunch at 1, stop again at 4 for tea, and go on till about 7. And the scorer has to look at every single detail and record it all and so on, which was so boring. But I had 11 guys taking me out on a Saturday night every week, which wasn't bad. And anyway, but I then had a good time. My final year, beginning of my final year, the department chair, Professor Jeff Ball, summoned me to his office and told me he'd just come back from a meeting of all the department heads in the UK in metallurgy. And his was the only department that had a woman in it. And he said, of course I was enjoying myself at this point, and he said, if you don't pass, if you fail, there won't be another woman admitted to a metallurgy department in this country for many years. So I thought I'd better buckle down and do some work. But that's the kind of pressure I've been on all my early life. So I tried to work, and I got a degree. And when I was walking down the corridor, 3 feet off the floor, because I'd actually passed my exams, and I met Harry Paxton, who was on a sabbatical leave at Imperial that year. And he said in his lovely Yorkshire accent, "Well, don't think you know anything, lass. If ever you do get to know anything, I might offer you a job." He did subsequently offer me a job some years later, so I thought I must know something by then. But he brought me down to earth in a big bang. That was Harry. Very sweet, very kind man.
When you look back at your university time, do you, like, what all kind of feelings come up, right? So there's a lot of fun times, but there's also incidents where people, say things that are hurtful, maybe unintentionally. But so when you look back, what are the feelings that you have?
I enjoyed my time after the first 6 months or so. People, by and large, were very kind to me. But it was in the UK at the time, universities had dressed up balls several times a year. And the first couple of balls, I wasn't invited. And several men said to me afterwards, "You weren't at the ball." I said, "No." "Oh, I wanted to ask you, but I assumed you'd already, everybody else was asking you." Anyway, but we had great times. I've got some wonderful pictures, but I didn't bring them with the balls and things. We used to get up at 4 in the morning and go to the florists at the market and bring it back to the university, decorate the hall and everything, and then we'd be still dancing at 4 o'clock the next morning, that was kind of thing. And the men bought a tuxedo first year, and it was worn out by final year. Women, of course, had to spend money on different dresses every time, but so on. No, I had a good time. There's a lot of talk these days about teenage girls being bitchy. I never found that at high school. We didn't have any of that stuff at high school at all. And I was horrified when I went to university to see how some of the men treated other men, the bullying. I was just completely shocked. It was a total eye-opener to me. I had never seen that in a girls' school. And so that was an eye-opener, which was disappointing. But by and large, I had a very good time, and I have very fond memories of Imperial College. I lived in residence, and residence in 1959, they were miles apart in most universities. Not icy, they didn't know what to do with the women, so they just made one floor of the men's dorm a woman's dorm, and we were free to go everywhere we want. I remember my father being horrified. "You can have men in your bedroom?" I said, "Dad, it's not my bedroom, it's my study." And, but we all survived. I don't recall any pregnancies, so there must have been something going on that was right. We were only 25 people in the first year. Imperial College only had 3,000 students. 1,500 were undergrads, 1,500 were grads. The college was formed by Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, with the funds from the Crystal Palace a world exhibit in the 1800 and something or other, and he set it up as Imperial College with the idea of attracting students from all around the world in the British Empire at the time. So we probably had a more diverse, not very diverse by today's standards, anything like, but more diverse than, say, Oxford or Cambridge or some of the rural universities. So that was the background of it. And I think it was a very good, it's well known as a very good university, and I learned a lot. The first lecture on the first morning was given by an elderly gentleman, Professor Andrade, who talked to us about presenting data in graphical form. And it's amazing what you remember. I can remember this so clearly. He was, talking about graphs and so on, and he said, if one of your experimental data points lie on the curve, your results are good. If 2 lie on the curve, they're excellent. If 3 lie on the curve, it's obviously fiddled. So that was my introduction. But thing was, you had a question here about political and cultural events. When I went up to university, we were still in the throes of the after effects of World War II. Food rationing had only been stopped a couple of years prior to that. So there wasn't a lot of interest in politics. Everybody wanted peace and quiet and so on. And we didn't have much money. One of my friends in graduate school had a 1920s sewing machine, so we taught ourselves to sew clothes, and we'd go down to the market and buy the ends of the roll. And fortunately, miniskirts came in, which meant you could get a dress with long sleeves out of 1 yard of material. It was wonderful.
Carolyn, can you tell me about any internships or things you had while doing your studies?
Yes, we didn't have a co-op system, which is typical now, but we were expected to work during the summer months. And my first summer month, I worked in a steel plant, fairly local to where I lived in Cheshire. And that was very interesting, but just, wolf whistles everywhere and so on. But by this time, I was used to it from school, from the university, so it didn't have much effect on me. The next year, I had applied for and been accepted to go to Chalk River nuclear research in Canada, and was, really excited about this. Until a few weeks before I was due to go, they said, "Carolyn, that's a woman's name. We don't have women in Chalk River." So that was the end of that. However, while all my classmates were working in steel mills in Sweden and, on the rolling mill or on the furnace or whatever, I ended up working for Johnson Matthey's precious metal division, where everything was in miniature because we were working on ruthenium and rhodium and everything. So I learned all about swaging and rolling and drawing and extrusion and everything, not just one parameter. So it worked out very well, but I would have liked to have gone to Chalk River. But yeah.
It took them a while to realize that you had a woman's name?
Who knows who looked at my, Yeah, presumably.
So not so smart on them.
Right.
So what was your first kind of professional job after you left university?
After I turned down the head of the
after
the
you
lab,
turned down your
lab.
secretarial...
Yes. Well, I then actually did a PhD, but after I finished my PhD, my thesis supervisor introduced me to Bert Westwood, whom you may know because he was a president of TMS at one point. Bert was head of the labs at Marietta, and so he invited me my husband got a job in Maryland, so that's why I went over there. And I had done my thesis work on superconductivity and crystal structure at liquid helium temperatures. There's not a lot of call for that, actually. So I was interviewed for a job, and I actually consider my success in getting the job had less to do with the fact that I'm obviously a brilliant person, and more to do with the fact that, as I say, miniskirts had come in England. They hadn't come in America. And I'd come over with a wardrobe full of miniskirts, and there was no way I was going to go out and buy clothes. So I ended up going to the interview, which was, of course, all men. And I mentally wrote a line on the blackboard above which I shouldn't draw because, then you have to lift your arm up and so on. And I filled it. And then I turned around to the audience and said, "Does anybody have a rubber anywhere?" Because I didn't know this is the word for an eraser in English. So that's why I think I got the job. Anyway, they did tell me that if I worked out, they would consider hiring other women. Again, the same thing over and over again, right? So I thought the best thing I could do is do well at the job. So that's what I've tried to do ever since.
So do you think that you handle pressure excessively well? Multiple times now we've heard that someone tells you, if you don't do well, every woman in the rest of history is out. But you seem to excel, even though you had this, the pressure of every woman for all time on your shoulders.
Yeah, but I excelled because I took the word seriously and I worked hard. But I did, I found the English sense of humor is very good. It stood me in stead a lot of times. People make a pass at you, you make a joke of it. I remember one time I was at a conference and Bert Westwood, in fact, introduced me to somebody, I'm not going to mention his name, of course, and said, Carolyn, you've got to pick this person's brain because we want to get into directional solidification, and he knows everything about directional solidification. This was in the 60s, right? And so this gentleman said to me, do you like a drink? So we went, I'd just given a talk, and I was, you know, it's like you let down. So I thought a drink would be nice. So we go into the bar, and he leans over the table and said, well, would you like to go to bed before or after dinner? So I said, oh, I'm sorry. You should have asked me earlier. You're number 10 in line. And we can laugh about it. And, you know, I have to work with him. So that's the kind of thing I learned to do. And it's made my life so much easier. You know, if you're going to complain every time somebody says, what's a pretty little thing like you doing in a place like this? Life's hard. I just turn around and say, I think you're cute too, you know. End of story. So that's how I've dealt with my stress. Make a joke of it.
Did person A, when you said you're 10th in line, did they get the point and never come back?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so they all got your British. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so they all took it well.
Yeah. But when you ask pressure, when I got to Martin Marietta, they said, we want you to work on liquid metal embrittlement. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, you better find out because we've got to get a proposal into the Naval Ordnance Lab in 3 weeks. And we got the contract.
Congratulations.
But you know, the silly things happen. I was doing work for the Naval Ordnance Lab, and at one point I was asked to go and make a presentation to an arsenal, Rock Island Arsenal. Yes, it does exist. And I was due to get a flight, and at 11 o'clock in the morning I suddenly thought, I don't have clearance for an arsenal. And Bert said to me, who's my boss, said to me, go and talk to the office and they'll see what they can sort it out. Get on the plane and we'll see what we can do. So I get on the plane and I go over to Rock Island and get off. And it turns out that the company had got in touch with the British Embassy to get clearance and so on and so forth. And the British Embassy was closed because it was the Queen's birthday. So everybody gave me a pass. So I went in with no problem.
Happy birthday, Queen.
Exactly. So these quirky things happen, you know. I didn't tell you about the time I went to Moscow at a time when it was the USSR as a graduate student. I went with my supervisor, and that was very interesting because you know you were watched 100% of the time, and we were warned that people would try to proposition you and get you into a bad situation and so on. And we were there because in my thesis work, my supervisor and I had developed a low-temperature X-ray diffraction attachment that you could measure the lattice parameters at 7 degrees Kelvin. You know? And we'd sold this, licensed it to Oxford Instruments, who paid us to go over and demonstrate this thing. So we get there, and it was very weird. And we weren't allowed to spend money. We were given coupons for meals and so on and so forth. And at one point, I've been trying to remember the name of the academician. Hugh King, my supervisor, had arranged for us to go and meet an academician. And they're like God in the USSR. So we were in his office, bowing and scraping a little bit. And my supervisor, who was very calm and whatever, suddenly said, I need a glass of water, and he promptly collapsed on the floor. So a very pretty doctor was called in, and she started opening him up and so on. And he'd had surgery the year before, and he'd got this red scar down. So she thought, you know, there was something terribly wrong. Got to go to hospital, and I'm thinking, if I allow him to go to hospital and he never comes out, Anne will never forgive me, Anne being his wife. If I don't let him go and he dies, Anne will never forgive me, you know. So we ended up, yes, he should go to hospital, and we were told everybody spoke English. I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. We got in the ambulance. First thing we did was have a crash with an army truck, which didn't, fortunately we weren't hurt. Got to the hospital, nobody spoke English, nobody. So they put the two of us in this room, and they started undressing him, because of course everybody assumed I was his wife. I've been assumed to be the wife of anybody I stood next to at things, you know. So I'm thinking he's going to be terribly embarrassed if he wakes up and he finds him here in his stock neck. Anyway, I went through his pockets and took all his, we'd had to surrender our passports as soon as we got into Moscow, so that didn't matter, but I took his money and all the other ID and so on, and politely turned my back and so on. Anyway, it turned out he just had problems because he'd had this surgery which had removed half his intestines because of a burst ulcer. And so he hadn't been eating properly. But he was in hospital for several days. And we had planned to go to the Moscow circus with bears on ice. And I went in one day and he's sitting with a Russian dictionary trying to write in Russian, please may I go to the circus, like a little boy. Anyway, we got him out. In the meantime, we'd met a couple of East German guys, lovely young men, who didn't have any money because the exchange rate between East Germany and Russia was so bad, so they couldn't do anything. But when Hugh came out of hospital, we got all his meal coupons, which we spent. We took these two East Germans to the best restaurant in town. And I remember we had rather a lot of champagne. I can remember dancing through the Red Square with these three guys, my supervisor and these two East Germans, and things like that. My profession has allowed me to do these. If I had been a nurse or a teacher or whatever, that wouldn't happen. It's just amazing. So I've been very lucky.
So we heard about a couple of different bosses or mentors that you've had. Are there any other influential mentors you've had in your career that you want to tell us interesting or fun stories about?
I'm not sure about interesting or fun stories, but I've got a lot of people who have gone out of their way to support me and help me. And surprisingly, several, apart from Hugh King, who was a young assistant professor when he met me, he had the guts to take on the first woman who hadn't achieved all the best things in the world. And he's thriving. He lives on Salt Spring Island in Canada, and he's 91 this year. The next one was Bert Westwood, who is the best boss anybody could possibly have imagined. He pushed his people and stood in the background. He was great. He's now living in Albuquerque, and I speak to him and his wife once in a while. Harry Paxton was another person who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, and I didn't know until after he died that he had been instrumental in nominating me for some awards. I was told this afterwards, but unfortunately I never had the opportunity to say thank you. Do you remember Keith Brimacombe? He was a fantastic guy. He died far, far too young. He was also a mentor, and when he was president, he was so proud to invite the board. I was on the board of governors at the time. Board of directors here. And he invited us all to the Rockies. He came from that area in Canada. We had a great time. He called me one day, must have been in 1995, and said, I think you should apply for that job at Waterloo. And I said, what job and why? And he said, because I think Waterloo is your kind of university. And I said, why? And he said, trust me. So I said, okay. So I applied, and I said, you have to write a letter, and I got the job. He died 2 years later, very early. He had been appointed as head of a new program, a Pan-Canada program called the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. And he was working so hard, he neglected his health and died of a heart attack. Very, very sad. More recently, Rusty Gray and Hanny Heinen have both been very helpful in myself. So all of these ex-presidents of TMS, I don't know what TMS is producing, but it's certainly very productive as far as the idea of mentorship is concerned.
Are there any commonalities between those folks that you think made them especially effective mentors for you?
Yes. I think they appreciated the fact that women can give a different perspective on things and promoted that. None of them was afraid of competition, and I think that makes a big, big difference.
You told us about your first job that you had at the Martin Marietta Research Labs doing liquid metal embrittlement. We know you eventually made your way to Waterloo. Where all have you been in between there?
I've been married twice, and both husbands have been the type that don't stay in a job for more than 5 minutes. So like a dutiful wife, I followed them around. And my first husband moved from Maryland to Long Island, so I applied to the State University, or Bert Westwood actually called the head of the department at State University of New York in Stony Brook and said, you know, he'd got this person he highly recommended. And the answer was, well, she's a married woman, she doesn't need the money, we could give her a bit of lab space to play in. So Bert said, I don't think that would go. And at the time, Columbia University was advertising for a assistant professorship in metallurgy. So I applied. And of course, again, I was the only woman on the faculty. So when I got the job, I remember going for the interview and I'd taken slides with me. For those of you who don't know what slides are, they're about that size and you have a thing and you put them on and it projects on the screen. I had all my slides with me. We go into the room, there was no projector. And they expected me to do everything with chalk on the board. I never got one sentence out with them interrupting with a question, and they hammered home, and I thought, well, that's dead. Looking back, I think they were trying to figure out if I was capable of dealing with a room of boys. And they accepted me. And my first class, I ended up teaching a graduate class, and I was the youngest person in the class. So then commuting from Long Island to New York, I enjoyed Columbia, and I would go there again if it didn't happen to be placed where it was at the time, which was not very good, and I was doing a huge commute. I got a phone call a year later from Stony Brook, said they'd had a coup and kicked the chair out, and would I like a position? And it was just down the road from where I lived, so I said yes. And so I was there for a while, and in fact, a few years later, I was sitting in the chair where this other person had been. So, and that was fun too. And then Bell Labs offered me a job. Now, Bell Labs in those days was the top lab in the world, and they had decided they should have some women on the thing. So nothing to do with my abilities. I wore a skirt, you know. I got there, and everybody wore a suit, dark blue suit, a blue button-down collar shirt, and a tie. Everybody. It was a uniform. It was unbelievable. And the competition, or the pressure was, you know, produce, produce, produce. I had been there 4 months when I adopted a son. And you asked me earlier, how did that affect life? That was very interesting. Fortunately, I did get a place at the last minute in a daycare center that was built as a daycare center and was actually on PBS as how a daycare center should work. It was fantastic. Some of the places were for people like me who could pay for the thing. Some were partially supported and some were free for the low income. So it had people from Jersey City and places where lower income and every color of skin under the sun. And my son went there.
When you were at Bell Labs, you said that you adopted your son at that point. What was it like kind of bringing a son into your life and integrating your professional life at Bell Labs with being a parent and whatnot? What can you tell us about that?
Well, my son was 16 months old when I adopted him, and walking and getting into all sorts of trouble. We adopted him on the 23rd of December. On the 24th of December, I went and bought 27 door and drawer locks to close everything because he could get into everything and did. But I could go on at length about adopting. It was the best thing I have ever done in my life. He is going to be a parent. I'm going to be a grandma in June.
Congratulations.
And he has been wonderful. An excellent son. And when he got to 21, I remember thinking, oh, Carolyn, here, have a drink. He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't been binge drinking. He didn't smoke. He hadn't done drugs. What more could you ask, you know? Anyway, back to 1976. Bell didn't know what to do with me. As I think I told you before this video, I discovered that most men had never worked with a woman. As far as they were concerned, women were wives, either their own or somebody else's, or a secretary, and they just didn't know how to cope. And so I got a lot of silly comments. And so I decided my role was to put them at their ease. If we had to work together, I couldn't have somebody, you know, working with me who didn't know how to handle me or didn't know how to treat me. So I spent quite a bit of humorous effort in making sure that they didn't go overboard one way or the other. But I remember being in a meeting shortly after I adopted Russell, my son. Came to 5 o'clock, and the meeting was being held by the director and the chair and so on. And I said, well, excuse me, gentlemen, I have to go now. Nobody had ever said that at a meeting in Bell. They went on until the business was finished. And they just looked at me completely blankly and said, you can't leave, we're not finished. I said, I'm sorry, I can. I'm not having my 18-month-old sitting on the side of the street because the meeting's going on too long, so thank you. And it was awful. They obviously thought I was not part of the team, that I wasn't going to produce. But when they discovered that I was just as productive as they were, because I went home, I dealt with my son. When he went to bed, I did some work, you know? So they accepted it. And they had a woman technician there from Germany, and they very tentatively asked me if I would be willing to have her work as my technician. I said I'd love to, which surprised them. And do you know, there were men standing outside the lab door expecting to hear fireworks because they had assumed two women couldn't work together? The two of us were great friends. All they heard actually was laughter and giggling. But that was the attitude. They had no idea about working themselves with women or about women working with women. So it was very different. Yeah, very different.
Is there anything looking back that you wished, not specifically like in your own life, but outside of your life that influenced your life with you and your son that you wish would have been different, would have made things easier for you or more manageable?
Well, I was very lucky, as I say, because there was this fantastic daycare center, and I actually lived in less than a mile from the lab. I could have walked there every day, but I had a 12-mile round trip to the daycare center. But no, I don't think so. I think everything worked out amazingly well. Of course, there were hiccups and so on. But one of the best things I ever did as a mother, with all due respect to the United States and Canada, I moved to Denmark when he was 5. And I was able to be a good mother in Denmark because people are not so work-driven, and they are just as much or more productive than North Americans. So I worked from 8:30 until 4:30. I did not take work home with me unless there was a panic on, and then there'd be a couple of weeks of mad work. I did not work at the weekends. I was able to go to his basketball games and soccer games and so on and so forth. I was able to be a good mother, and we were there until he was 14. And then we came to Canada, and again, back to the work grind. It's crazy the way North Americans work. And it's not necessary. I mean, it's not productive to put in all those hours. You cannot concentrate all those hours. So my goal is to say, okay, America, okay, Canada, let's have this 8:30, 4:30, and go home and be a parent or a partner or a single person having fun, right?
So when you went to Canada, did you put in your kind of own, I'm doing 8:30 to 4:30 and...
You have to be kidding. I was appointed as head of the department at Queen's University, Metallurgy department. No. You know, the problem with academia is you're working 3 jobs that each one should be full-time. You're being a teacher, which should be full-time. You're being a researcher, which should be full-time. And you're being a professional, which should be full-time. And that's just not possible, you know. None of us has, you know, more than 24 hours in a day, and we would like to sleep sometime.
So what advice do you have for like the younger versions of you out there?
No, I wouldn't have advice for the younger versions. I'd have advice for the administration. Stop this publish or perish ridiculousness. Stop this counting H factors. Who the heck cares? You know, I see people, I have been on a number of committees where I've stopped and said, this isn't right. I look at a CV and somebody's got 600 publications and I say, how old is this person? And they said, well, what's that got to do with it? I say, how old is he? And I do the calculation. I say, excuse me, he's claiming to have had a publication every 10 days for 40 years. That's not possible. He's put its name on stuff that other people have done, and that's unethical. So that's what I'd like to do. Stop this counting of metrics. It's nothing to do with quality. It's nothing to do with achievement. And when I can remember, oh God, where was it? Barrett, what was his first name? Metallurgist, long before you were born. He said, I think it was he, said, if you have enough work, you should aim to publish 2 papers a year. If you have enough work for 4 papers, keep 2 of them, you may have a lean year. If you publish 2 papers a year now, you're regarded as incompetent. It's not realistic. It's not realistic to have a research group with 20 graduate students. You cannot mentor 20 people. And I think that's where I'd like to see the change.
Can we hire you as president of all universities?
I'd love to be. I mean, or NSF.
Yeah.
NSF should put that down. I mean, the university, the equivalent in Canada has now said, we don't want to see all your papers. We want to see what have you done in the last 6 years. But even then, they're counting. And I have made this, when I review a paper, I write back to NSERC, Natural Science and Engineering Research Council, equivalent of NSF, and say, this person claims to have averaged so many papers per year for the last 6 years. This is not possible. And we have to, but I'm a lone person. Nobody else seems to be doing this. My question is, why not? Why don't you go home and next time you review a paper or a proposal, say the same thing? I will. Wow, my CV is, my publication record is low compared to most. Well, of course, no, your publication is not low because you're working on corrosion, and corrosion isn't. If you're doing a tensile test, you do the test, you've got the data point. If you do corrosion, you've got to wait. Thank God. Otherwise, the chairs we're sitting in, we would be on the floor. The concrete floor would have fallen apart. I mean, that's the problem with corrosion.